Hello again, and welcome back. Yes, this is another episode of No Free Lunch, Economics for a Fallen World. By this time, you probably know who both of us are, so let's go ahead and get started. The Federal Reserve, our central bank in the U.S., formed in 1913.
1913.
A little over 100 years.
The law was passed, so it was established in 1914.
There you go. So give us some more history of the Fed.
Let's take a step back further. And central banks are a relatively recent phenomenon. There were central banks earlier, but the Bank of England in 1694 is kind of considered the real first bank. One of the kings of England, I forget which one, there are so many kings of England, I'm not a historian of that nature, wanted to go fight another war against France, and the banks would no longer loan him any money, so he says, well, I'll make my own bank. And this is kind of important. I'm not just making fun of the banking. You need to understand that banks, central banks, are always at the end of the day, their purpose is to fund the sovereign, and that's what we see even in the United States. We've recently had a financial crisis, and then subsequently we've had a COVID-19 crisis, and the Federal Reserve has bought a lot of government debt. So it's not caused much pain for the U.S. government to try to deal with the crisis because there's been a ready buyer of that debt. So that's the ultimate purpose. There's all sorts of other public purposes that are said, but the origins kind of tell the story. And when you see the actions in countries, especially under a kind of emergency situations, you understand what the real purpose is, which is to fund the government, ultimately. It does other things as well. But we got our central bank in 1913. There had been agitation. We'd had kind of central banks, quasi-central banks in the early 1800s until Andrew Jackson put a stop to the Bank of the U.S. But we ultimately, there's a lot of people that wanted to have a central bank. Other nations in Europe had central banks at the time. We had a number of financial panics that they thought, well, hey, if we had a central bank that could have what they called an elastic currency that could print money effectively, then you wouldn't have this problem, because what would happen is all these banking panics, there would be a run on the bank because of a poor harvest or what have you. And the people would want safety. They wouldn't necessarily want to spend it, but they want their money, but they couldn't get money because the money's all tied up in a loan somewhere else. And it caused a lot of bank failures. And so that it was asserted, if we just had a central bank that could loan money, that would solve this problem. There was a particularly bad financial crisis in 1907, which ultimately led to the agitation, which led to our central bank. The law was passed in 1913, established in 1914. So we've had just a little over 100 years of a central bank in this country. And the performance of the central bank, I would assert, has not been good. Some of the arguments, economist George Selgin has looked at kind of the 100 years since we've had a Fed to the 100 years before, and compared all the arguments and the economic variables that were used to say we should have a Fed, unemployment, inflation variability, all these kind of things you might be concerned about. And our record post the Fed, even aside from the Great Depression, which is arguably the Fed's biggest catastrophe, is worse. So it's not clear at all that economic performance is better with a Federal Reserve, and there are many arguments to say it might be worse. But we have a Fed, so now one of the big debates is, okay, if we have a central bank, and in the book we talk about what's the second best world we're going to live in, and that gets an argument over rules versus discretion. Do we want to fix what the Fed can do? Issue a certain amount of money to be issued per time to target a certain inflation rate, or do we just let them do what they want to? Right now, we've been in for quite a while of just let the Fed do whatever they want, which may not be the best answer. I would assert not, but that's kind of where we are today.
Tools. What kind of tools does the Fed use to influence?
Sure, and that gets to some of the history of why the Fed's had some problems. So the Fed, we have three tools that we talk about typically in the textbooks, but none of those are really used today. And I'm going to introduce a fourth one that's not in the textbooks, really. I've just briefly mentioned it in the third edition update. But in the early 1920s, the Federal Reserve needed to make some money to operate. And so they started buying bonds to make the interest to fund their operations. And what they found was in the very act of buying an asset and paying for it with Federal Reserve reserves, would lead to expansionary stimulative policy. They discovered open market operations, that's what we call it today, the buying and selling of assets in the open markets by providing reserves that goes in the fractional reserve banking system and can be multiplied and so forth. But they didn't even know it. It was not meant to be monetary policy. They found out it could be used for monetary policy. They were simply trying to make some interest to be able to fund their operations. So open market operations is, for the 100 years until about 2008, that was the primary tool, in part because the second tool would be the required reserve ratio. And that determines what fraction of the deposits that a bank gets they have to hold back in the vault, so to speak, and what fraction can be loaned out. So a higher required reserve ratio would be kind of less expansionary than a lower required reserve ratio. But we had a crazy situation in the 1937 timeframe in the Great Depression where the Federal Reserve, and I'll spare you viewers now from all the details, but they were concerned about the banks had a lot of excess reserves and they were afraid, what if they loan them all out? And now we could have a massive inflation after we've just went through all this deflation. They decided to sop up those reserves, so to speak, by increasing the required reserves. And the banks had those excess reserves for a reason and proceeded to build up those required reserves. They stopped making loans, and the U.S. was coming out of the Great Depression fairly robustly in 1935-36, and that crash. It was a secondary depression, was quite violent. And the lesson learned that the Fed uses, well, we really shouldn't use required reserves as a monetary tool because it's very blunt. So even, and they haven't changed those for quite some time now, but even in the last 30 or 40 years, when they did make a small change, they'd always try to offset that effect with open market operations. The final tool is called the discount rate, and that would be if you were a bank, in an earlier video, because I alluded to Dr. Guernsey's previous life as a banker, he would have just made a loan and not worried whether he had the reserves, and he might have to go, you might have, your banking career might have to, your bank might have to go to the Federal Reserve and ask for a loan, because it has a legal requirement to have a certain amount of reserves on, and you would pay an interest rate. We would call that the discount rate. And so that's the third tool. If they raise that rate, that tends to be contractionary. If they lower the rate, that would tend to be expansionary. So that's a third tool. So that's what's taught in all the textbooks today, except for since 2008, we don't follow really any of those rules. The primary way the Federal Reserve operates today is by paying interest on reserves. This has allowed them to have a very, very large balance sheet without that large balance sheet expanding into the general economy and causing a very high inflation rate, which some people feared, but they basically pay interest on those reserves to encourage the banks not to let those reserves be used in the economy in a way that would lead to inflationary results. They like this better because that allows them to buy assets and conduct other what they call macroprudential policies to try to steer the economy without having an inflationary effect. But that begs the question about, how much should the Federal Reserve be deciding where capital is allocated? That raises a whole host of other questions as well. So that's the tool today is interest on reserves to control monetary policy.
And you say that fourth one is not in the book necessarily.
Yeah, I allude to, I have it in the third edition. We
Okay.
talked to it just very briefly, but that's not the primary tool. And you don't see it in many textbooks because the reality, and I make this sad commentary to all my students every year, I would love to teach you a formal framework, but the Fed really is making it up as they go along. They just announced, for instance, just a few weeks ago, try to give a theoretical justification. Now they're going to change their framework and allow much higher levels of inflation than in the past, and for longer periods of time. And so these kind of things, which is exactly counter to what the Federal Reserve did even 20 years ago. Drastically different policy with, in my mind, no theoretical or practical justification for what they're doing. But that's what's happening at the Federal Reserve.
There you go. All right, well, thanks for joining us for this conversation about the Federal Reserve. We'll see you next time.